Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're thrilled to have you here with us today for Leo Rosten and the translation of Yiddish Joy with Sonny Yudkoff. This lecture is a part of our Uriel Weinreich summer program in Yiddish language, literature, and culture. It's a part of what we call our Yiddish Civilization lecture series, which is a series of lectures that are both a part of our Yiddish language instruction this summer, but also open to the broad public. It's a way that we bring the Yiddish learning that we're having about not just the language, but also literature and culture and history to our public programs audience. So we're thrilled that all of you could join us for this. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to David Brown. David, what is your title at the summer program?
At the summer program, I'm called Academic Director.
So the academic director of our summer program to introduce today's speaker, Sonny Yudkoff.
My pleasure. And this is the 56th year of the summer program. And Sonny, it is our pleasure to launch this lecture series with you. I will read your biography shortly, your academic biography, and just make the mention that it was a pleasure being there at the very beginning of your foray into the intellectual world of what Yiddish has to offer. We've known each other since Sonny's undergraduate class in Yiddish at Harvard University in the philosophy building, as far as we can remember. Sonny Yudkoff joined the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic, as well as the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the fall of 2016. Before that, she taught at the University of Chicago. Her research and teaching focuses on Jewish literary production from the mid-19th to 21st centuries. Her first book, Tubercular Capital, Illness and the Conditions of Modern Jewish Writing, was published with Stanford University Press in 2019. She regularly teaches courses in both Jewish studies and the medical humanities. Her work has appeared in Proof Texts, Journal for the Journal of Jewish Social Studies, Studies in American Jewish Literature, Literature and Medicine, and elsewhere. And it's a pleasure to have her speaking from an academic point of view, from an analytical point of view, on a book that has for the past 50 plus years, 56 years, not received much academic analysis. It has remained a bestseller in Jewish Life and Letters, but hasn't been analyzed in the way that it's really been ripe to be analyzed for so long. Sonny, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm just going to set up my presentation, share my screen. Okay, and Alex or David, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great. So let me start by thanking David Brown, my first Yiddish teacher. It's a real pleasure to think with him today, to think with all of you about this text. I'm honored to present in the Yiddish Civilization lecture series at YIVO. I'm also appreciative of the work of Julia Rothkopf and Alex Weiser, who helped facilitate my talk today. And looking at the list of attendance, I'm really grateful to the current YIVO students who are watching and to my former students who are in the audience. I'm really grateful that you're here today, and I'm looking forward to thinking together. Okay. So let me start with a question. Who here is familiar with the Joys of Yiddish? Now, I can't see your hand, but I'm going to assume that you are raising your hand. And I'm going to assume that if I'd asked this question in 1968, 1969, and you were of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, you surely would have raised your hand. The book was an immediate smash success, selling more than 100,000 copies in its first year, and it remains in print to this day. But the book is also cumbersome. It's over 500 pages. Here's the hard copy. Over 500 pages of definitions, plus an appendix of short essays on various topics in Jewish history and culture. It's a popular book, to be sure, but it's impossible to read cover to cover. So how does one historicize it? How do you read it? And what vision of joy did the volume project? What I'm going to be talking about today over the next 40 minutes or so is I want to answer that question by investigating how Rosten teaches his readers to say joy in Yiddish. And I'm asking and answering these questions at a moment in Jewish studies when scholars are turning to the post-war Jewish bookshelf to understand the relationship of what people read and the construction of identity. Barry Trachtenberg, for example, has looked at the history of the Yiddish Encyclopedia to understand the types of questions Yiddish speakers were asking before the war, and decades into the project, what type of questions American audiences were asking about pre-war Jewish life. Rachel Gordon has turned to popular literature as well as basic introductions to Judaism to understand how the questions Jewish Americans were asking about themselves demanded an understanding of Jewishness in the post-war period as a religion rather than as a race. As both Trachtenberg and Gordon have shown, books, especially reference books, not only reflect readerly attitudes, but shape them. And in the post-war decades, Jewish American audiences were eager for information and for that information to be available in English. I'm entering into this discussion with the Joys of Yiddish, and what I want to understand and what I'll be talking through today is how this volume promoted a specific vision of the meaning of Yiddish as a cultural touchstone. Now, before we examine what Yiddish meant to Rosten, it's helpful to establish some groundwork as to what Yiddish is. And while this information may be well known to YIVO audiences, it's helpful to rehearse for a baseline for our discussion. So the first thing to remember is that Yiddish is a Germanic language. It's written in Hebrew characters. Okay? It is the language of East European Jewry and the Ashkenazi diaspora. It's also a language of everyday life. So you can speak Yiddish in the home, in the school. You can speak Yiddish when you're teaching math. You could speak Yiddish when you are in a restaurant. So it can be a language that works fully functioning in all aspects of Jewish life and in all cultural spheres, in the workplace, in politics, all over. It's also famously been called a fusion language. That is to say, it is a language that draws on several different linguistic strata, and the Yiddish speaker is aware of that component consciousness. That is to say, it's a Germanic base. It has lots of words of Hebrew and Aramaic origin, as well as Slavic origin, depending on where Yiddish was spoken. Different words from Polish and Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian entered the lexicon. And the Yiddish speaker is themselves aware of this multilingual potential in the language. Okay? Another thing we want to be aware of is the reasons for the general decline in Yiddish as a spoken language, as a language of everyday life. And in general, we might say that there are four main reasons for the decline of Yiddish. And this is not to say that Yiddish is not spoken today, but just the general arc of its decline. The first, of course, is the Holocaust and the attempted destruction of European Jewry and European Jewish culture. The second would be the suppression of Yiddish in the Soviet Union after it was first promoted. The third is the establishment of Hebrew as the official state language of Israel, primarily in the Hebrew as an official state language in Israel and its Jewish population to the exclusion of Yiddish. And finally, linguistic assimilation in the United States. But what Yiddish is not the same as what Yiddish means, right? So what Yiddish is or is not the same as what Yiddish means. And Yiddish has long meant more to its speakers and to the descendants of its speakers than simply a communicative language. So Benjamin Harshaw famously asserted that Yiddish was the carrier of a second level of social language, a peculiar semiotics of Jewish communication. This is a way of saying that it matters not only what is said in Yiddish, but the fact that it is said in Yiddish specifically. And that was true for Yiddish speakers in Eastern Europe and for their descendants in post-war America. In large measure, we might say that part of what makes Yiddish Yiddish is the assumption that the community of speakers is Jewish. And with internal to the Yiddish language, lahavdil lashon, this language of differentiation, you can have a Yiddish word, for example, for a kosher slaughterer, that is a Jewish slaughterer of animals, and a non-Jewish slaughterer of animals. So baked into the language is this sense of communal differentiation. Now, the meaning of Yiddish, that is to say, Yiddish meant something over and above its spoken value, even in Eastern Europe, has changed as the idea of the meaning of Yiddish has cohered in the United States. Jeffrey Chandler has put it most succinctly and most iconically in his evaluation of post-vernacular Yiddish. And what he describes as post-vernacular Yiddish, that is to say Yiddish after it is vernacular, following this decline, that when we talk about post-vernacular Yiddish, it means having an affective, an emotional, or ideological relationship with Yiddish without having command of the language, right? So Yiddish makes you feel something. You think about Yiddish in a certain way. And by and large, in the post-Holocaust era, that has been an idea of Yiddish as comedic and Yiddish as crass. And here is an example from a film, a popular film that you may have seen, right? Yiddish comes to mark a certain mode of comedy, a certain mode of vulgarity, and a certain mode of humor. What I haven't yet said is that in the post-war period, Yiddish comes to be known as joyous, right? So I'm going to say it now. What does it mean to think about Yiddish as joyous? You might say Yiddish is funny or Yiddish is crass, but why not joyous? And this is where our story really starts. What I want to examine, it was determines or over-determines how Leo Rosten came to create a book, a best-selling book called The Joys of Yiddish. And I want to understand how he translated the term joy. What did Yiddish joy mean to Leo Rosten and subsequent generations of readers? So to answer that, the first thing we have to ask is, who was Rosten? So here's an image of Rosten. Rosten was born in Łódź in 1908. He immigrated to America in 1911, where his family settled in Chicago. He taught English in a night school during his own college years, and it inspired several stories that he collected into the humorous work, The Education of Hyman Kaplan, complete with the stars. In the text, the eponymous hero, Hyman Kaplan, makes one English language mistake after the other. His malapropisms, however, reveal to his teacher the inequities of American life and confirm the protagonist's fundamental decency in the face of prejudice and corruption. After completing a doctorate in political science at the University of Chicago, where Rosten became lifelong friends with Milton Friedman, and additional postdoctoral work at the London School of Economics, Rosten became a Hollywood journalist and subsequently a screenwriter. He also published in 1941 the hit spy thriller All Through the Night, and his 1961 novel Captain Newman, M.D., which was adapted into an Academy Award-nominated film of the same name in 1963. When The Joys of Yiddish appeared in 1968, an executive from the United Artists Corporation wrote to Rosten to let him know that he had, quote, already given 6 copies to my colleagues. He thanked Rosten, quote, for producing an invaluable aid to negotiations. Now, the executive's unfortunate letter gives us our first taste of the joys of Yiddish in tone. The work provided humorous translations of a variety of Romanized Yiddish terms that, according to Rosten, were, quote, already part of everyday English, the examples being schmaltz, ganef, schlemiel, and these are his spellings. The second were words that were rapidly becoming part of English, chutzpah, megillah, schlepp, yenta, or, quote, that should be part of our noble language because, in my opinion, no English words so exactly, subtly, pungently, or picturesquely convey their meaning. Schmooze, kvetch, schlemazel, tchotchke, etc. With a nod to the Hollywood executive, Rosten further argued in the introduction to the work that Yiddish was a language of exceptional charm, bright, audacious, mischievous, steeped in sentiment, sliced with sarcasm, and as an artifact of post-vernacular culture, the joys of Yiddish invest the language with social significance and affective, that is to say, emotional valence, irrespective of its utility as a communicative system. Now, as a dictionary, it may seem counterintuitive that the joys of Yiddish focus on creating an emotional community. This is a concept I borrow from Barbara Rosenwein. It focused on creating an emotional community rather than a linguistic one. But for Rosten, the two were linked. The Joys of Yiddish was not an exhaustive reference work, but a selective one. As his archive demonstrates, and I'll talk about a little bit more on that later, Rosten carefully chose the terms included in the volume and heavily edited their definitions. What Rosten wanted his readers to feel was joy. How so? Happiness, as cultural critic Sarah Ahmed reminds us, is an emotional mode of relating to an object that has been socially conditioned to elicit a specific response. A promise, in Ahmed's terms, quote, that directs us towards certain objects. Those objects, in turn, circulate as social goods. As she further explains, quote, what is apt to cause pleasure is already judged to be good. I'm going to read that again. What is apt to cause pleasure is already judged to be good. So let's consider Rosten's title. Rosten's work scripts the reactions of its most ardent readers. The Joys of Yiddish, wrote a rabbi from New Hyde Park, New York, is a real joy, right? What is apt to cause pleasure is already judged to be good. I bought your book, The Joys of Yiddish, a few weeks ago, wrote another reader from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and cannot begin to tell you how much joy it has brought me. The sentiment was even echoed by Knesset member Gideon Hausner of Jerusalem. Hausner, the former Israeli Attorney General, who had led the prosecution team in the trial of Adolf Eichmann, wrote, quote, that the book is indeed a source of joy to the whole family. Other readers, writing from places as distant as Washington, D.C. and Oakland, California, turned the noun into a verb, indicating that they had enjoyed the Joys of Yiddish to an unanticipated degree. Art critic Clement Greenberg once famously noted that cultural kitsch, quote, provides vicarious experience. Rosten's Joys of Yiddish goes so far as to provide the language with which to describe that experience. And what's more, it provides readers not only with the words to praise the joys of Yiddish, but with the Yiddish words for joy themselves. Here, Rosten's work functions in parallel with its elusive namesake, Irma Rombauer's The Joy of Cooking. Self-published in 1931, Rombauer's work became a bestseller within a decade and a near byword for an accessible how-to guide for finding pleasure in the mundane. The legacy of the work's title is evidenced in volumes as varied as The Joys of Yiddish from 1968 and The Joy of Sex from 1972, to more recent iterations such as The Joy of Bird Feeding 2017, The Joy of Junk 2018, The Joy of Statistics 2019, and there are many such books. In her examination of The Joy of Cooking, Amanda Ray LaRoche has drawn attention to the subtitle of the original publication, a companion of relatable recipes with a casual culinary chat. Frequently, notes LaRoche, quote, joy read like a conversation with an old friend as opposed to a strictly instructional manual, end quote. It enabled Rombauer to recast cooking, something associated with the daily drudgery of women's household labor, with joy. 3.5 decades after Rombauer's first foray into the world of cookbook publishing, Rosten's volume entered the domestic sphere on similar terms, voiced in the first-person singular and often slipping into the first-person plural to reflect the reading community the text imagined. In lieu of recipes, Rosten's work provides a vocabulary list. As, quote, a relaxed lexicon, The Joys of Yiddish offers its readers a ready-made handbook of words and phrases to narrate their engagement with the text. Reviewers, in turn, invoked some of Rosten's more colorful terms in their reviews and even imitated the Yiddish syntax that Rosten included in his definitions. Money shmoney, declared one reviewer writing for Kirkus, a copy of this you should buy. Putting the noun before the verb, adding the mocking sh before the doubled noun, and introducing the modal imposition of will, should. Similar sentence structures and turns of phrases only confirm the suspicion Rosten announced in his preface. There, Rosten asserted that the time had come for the Joys of Yiddish because enough Yiddish words had entered the English language. As Rosten went on to explain, this is not a book about Yiddish. It is not a dictionary of Yiddish. It is not a guide to Yiddish. It is not written for experts in or students of Yiddish. Instead, quote, this is a book about language, more particularly the English language. It shows how our marvelously resilient tongue has been influenced by another parlance, Yiddish. With the possessive pronoun our, the Polish-born native Yiddish speaker firmly asserted his position in the Anglophone community of readers. The problem is, no one read the book this way. Writing for the Dublin-based Irish Times, Grattan Fryer addressed Rosten's idea as rather dubious. Apparently, we exclaim, aha, wrote Fryer about Rosten's entry for the verbal eruption. When we exclaim, aha, we are speaking Yiddish without knowing it. Maybe. And then with a twinkle in his eye, he parenthetically continued, but perhaps mebe is a Yiddish word. For the majority of Rosten's readers, The Joys of Yiddish was not received as marking the porous boundaries of the English language. Rather, it was a Yiddish resource, alternatively called a dictionary, a lexicon, encyclopedia, or in Rosten's handling, a word book, itself a gesture to the Yiddish term for a dictionary, Wörterbuch, Yiddish term for a dictionary. While readers and reviewers differed in how they defined the book, their praise coalesced around a series of 3 tropes, each dependent on a mode of joy articulated by the volume. First and foremost, the Joys of Yiddish was praised as a familial touchstone. Rosten's work reminded readers of the Yiddish that they had heard in their youth. As has been well documented, the 1960s saw efforts by second and third generation Ashkenazi Jewish Americans to carve out their ethnic identity in an American social landscape, increasingly aware of its multicultural composition. In her recent work, Salvage Poetics, Sheila Jelen has examined the importance of visually anchored folk ethnographies of Eastern Europe in this process. From Elizabeth Herzog and Mark Zborowski's Life is with the People of 1952, to Lucian Dobroszycki and Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimlet's Image Before My Eyes, 1977. For Rosten's readers, retrieving, or in Jelen's term, salvaging, the contours of their ethnic Jewish identity was enabled not by photography, but through memories activated by the Yiddish language. This was especially important for Rosten's readers who found a familial delight in the reading experience. "Your book, The Joys of Yiddish, is a gem," wrote a fan from Sierra Madre, California. "My mother passed on nearly 40 years ago, and since then I haven't uttered a dozen Yiddish words." A reader in Pittsburgh exclaimed, quote, "I had forgotten how much Yiddish I must have absorbed as a child." For these readers, Rosten's work reminded them of the real or imagined Yiddish terms of their youth. One management consultant wrote to Rosten from his Manhattan office on Park Avenue, exclaiming, "In a word, Geschmack, how else can I describe to you my enjoyment of your wonderful book, The Joys of Yiddish? It brings back such wonderful, delicious memories. Eldridge and Grand Street, my wonderful Zeta and Bubba, what a building 91 was, 47 Russian Jewish families and one family of Galicianers. You can imagine how they were beleidigt. Can you imagine 47 families on Shabbos night eating peppery gefilte fish, and by the Galicianers it was sugary sweet?" So perhaps in an unconscious reference to the joys of cooking, the consultant joins a chorus of letter writers whose praise for Rosten's work was couched in the language of gustatory delight. His words help us distinguish Rosten's demographic. His readers were those for whom the Yiddish language conjures up an image of Yiddish-speaking ancestors in America rather than in Eastern Europe. To be sure, the letter writers Zadie and Bubby may have been Galicianer immigrants, that is to say from Austro-Hungary, living among Russian Jewish immigrants, that is to say from the former Russian Empire, but their grandsons' memories of them were situated in the urban geography of the Lower East Side. And perhaps this is where the impact of Rosten's authorial intentions to write a book about English is most recognizable. The Joys of Yiddish seems to tap into a generational sweet spot, reminding its readers of their childhood experiences of Yiddish in America, but not of the Eastern Europe that Herzog, Zborowski, Dobroszycki, and Kirschenbach-Gimlet would attempt to translate. Part of the joy for these readers is their ability to feel a connection to Yiddish based in their childhood. It may come as no surprise that many of Rosten's readers write to him with hyperbolic words of praise, only to add that he forgot to include certain words, or that he defined terms in manner that didn't correspond to how their mothers or their grandmothers had used them. One fan from Los Angeles mentioned that they wanted a definition added to Rosten's entry for tatale, lamenting that Rosten, quote, "did not mention what my mother considered the real meaning of the word. To her, it was based on the Jewish custom of naming children after deceased parents and grandparents. I was named for her father, and she called me tatale on occasion because I was her little father," end quote. The letter writer's desire to offer an emendation based on his familial experience bespeaks a level of intimacy present throughout much of the fan mail and reviews. It also reflects an affective relationship to Yiddish that renders the language the purview of the Jewish home rather than the linguist's office. Most important, the rekindled childhood connection to Yiddish, as well as the insistence on the part of Rosten's readers that he, the author, the expert, did not tell the whole story, demonstrates the pride that the readers take as self-designated Yiddish authorities and heritage speakers of the language. Now, pride, or proud pleasure, is one of the three modes of joy identified in the Joys of Yiddish. Specifically, Rosten includes a page-long entry for the term Naches, which derives from the Hebraic component contentment, and it is defined as proud pleasure, special joy, particularly from the achievements of a child. This is how Rosten defines it. For many readers, Rosten himself was the source of such Naches. As one fan from Chicago, Illinois wrote, quote, "What a Naches your parents must feel, having such a prolific writer, speaker, raconteur, Talmud Chacham, and just a real mensch as their son." Others retold the story shared by Rosten that on completing the volume, his own mother had declared, quote, "You have saved Yiddish." According to Rosten, Naches also bears a secondary definition: psychological reward or gratification. In the entry for the terms, he adds, "I am getting Naches from writing this book, since a new book is indeed a brainchild." Rosten's readers, in turn, share in the joy of the Joys of Yiddish by manifesting a version of Naches that brings together the familial pride of the first definition with the psychological pleasure of the second. Rosten's readers identify as the American-born progeny of Yiddish-speaking parents, and with the publication of the Joys of Yiddish, they confidently recall the Yiddish they heard as children, and they proudly relay the definitions of Yiddish terms commonly used by their parents or in their households. In other words, they perform their Yiddish knowledge in a way that would allow their parents to experience Naches, and they feel their own Naches in applying that knowledge to correct the ostensible authority, Leo Rosten. Now, for Rosten's negative reviewers, there was nothing to be proud of. Irving Howe, the American socialist activist, literary critic, and committed detractor of the volume, took particular umbrage that familial sentiment was substituted for a serious account of the history, politics, and ideological struggles of Yiddish speakers. By the 1950s, Howe, a Yiddish speaker by birth, had become deeply invested in what Julian Levinson has described as, quote, the seriousness of Yiddish literature. Howe famously lambasted Fiddler on the Roof as, quote, irresistible bait for the nostalgia-smitten audience. The Joys of Yiddish met the same fate. In his words, quote, Yiddish is torn out of its cultural context, its integral world of meaning and reference. It is then served up to American Jews who cherish memories of their parents' conversation and become more and more damply nostalgic as they allow those memories comfortably to fade into the past. Disemboweled, Yiddish now bleeds on display for vulgarians and ignoramuses. No, not everything about Yiddish need be dry, solemn, and scholarly. But something about the Broadway cum TV tone of Mr. Rosten's book, the tone of elbow-nudging, backslapping, local color gives me the chill. Max Rosenfeld concurred. Reflecting on Howe's piece, he noted, quote, I confess to a similar impression. I'm afraid that the impression of Yiddish which Rosten's book will leave in the minds of those who know nothing else about it will need an awful lot of correcting. In his interview, he expressed preference for another book published by McGraw-Hill that same year, Columbia linguist Uriel Weinreich's College English Yiddish Dictionary, which was, until recently, a standard reference for those studying Yiddish. For the most part, though, corrections weren't on the minds of readers so much as praise for the scholarship. The second prominent trope of praise lavished on the Joys of Yiddish was not just that it stimulated the sense of familial touchstone, but that it was a work of careful erudition and research. In his reader report to McGraw-Hill, Simeon Potter, who had served as professor of English, language, and philology at the University of Liverpool from 1945 to 1965, declared, quote, the scholarship of the Joys of Yiddish is unimpeachable. A writer for the Detroit Jewish News declared it to be the definitive work on Yiddish words. That reviewer also extended praise for the thorough appendices included in the volume, quote, about great Jewish heroes and important historic events, Bar Kokhba, Akiba, the Kabbalah. Rosten noted the writer also, quote, explains the Jewish calendars, cantors, circumcision, the holidays, dialects, and false messiahs. The writer echoed comments of the famous anthropologist and Rosten's sister-in-law, Margaret Mead, who lauded the book for its ability to gather, quote, together a tremendous lore, linguistic, historical, religious, and hilarious, to educate readers. What Mead and others point to is the encyclopedic reach of the Joys of Yiddish, a reach that distinguished Rosten's work from other Yiddish dictionaries that had recently entered the marketplace, such as those that you see here, published between 1966 and 1968. What distinguishes Rosten's volume from its contemporaries is its status both as a dictionary and cultural reference. The books that you see in front of you are primarily joke definitions, right, or very short. As the subtitle of the text of Joys of Yiddish explained, Yiddish was a relaxed lexicon of Yiddish, Hebrew, and Yinglish words often encountered in English, plus dozens that ought to be, with serendipitous excursions into Jewish humor, habits, holidays, history, religion, ceremonies, folklore, and cuisine. the whole generously garnished with stories, anecdotes, epigrams, Talmudic quotations, folk sayings, and jokes from the days of the Bible to those of the beatniks. So using culinary language, Rosten introduces the Joys of Yiddish as a guide to Jewish American life. Bookended between Adonai and Zohar are the names of Jewish communal figures, prayers, rituals, and holidays. Appendices complete the book with entries covering everything from Jewish life cycle events to the immigration of Jews to the United States, to a brief history of the Jews of Cochin, India, to an entry entitled Crucifixion, Notes, where Rosten declares 6 years after Vatican II that, quote, the Jews never crucified anyone. So seesawing between the sacred and profane aspects of Jewish life, Rosten's work harnesses itself to an experiential form of joy localized in 2 consecutive entries. This is the second entry for joy. We had Naches, and now we have Simcha. And the 2 consecutive entries in the volume are for Simcha and Simchat Torah. The former, explains Rosten, derives from the Hebrew rejoicing. Adopted by Yiddish, it would serve to refer to a great pleasure, a happy occasion, a celebration. The events of the holiday of Simchat Torah, which Rosten defines as Hebrew for the day of rejoicing in the law, is subsequently described in page-long detail and includes such information as what portion of the Torah is read that day, how men, women, and children partake in the ceremony, how celebration differs in Reform temples and Hasidic congregations, and to understand how the act of rejoicing manifests in Yiddish, as these 2 entries convey, is to become familiar with aspects of Jewish American life that fall within and outside of the purview of religious practice. Rosten's admirers thanked him for providing such a thorough romp through contemporary Jewish life and discourse. A drama critic from the West Coast wrote to Rosten to thank him, quote, for providing a secret reference book for culturally deprived Jews, California-born Jews like myself. The letter also gestures towards a common refrain among Jewish readers, as well as Christian reviewers, that the book would serve as a bridge between Jews and Gentiles, an aspiration confirmed in Rosten's archive, which contains letters expressing similar sentiments from a Catholic housewife of Madison, Wisconsin, a Protestant missionary from Orlando, Florida, a nun from Mount Mary College in Milwaukee, and a linguist from the Ford Foundation. If the familial joy evinced by Rosten's volume was potentially confined to the Jewish community, the ability for the work to serve as a reference guide to Jewish American life, exploring events from Simchat Torah to the average Simcha, was now open to all. Unfortunately, for Rosten's naysayers, the publication of the work was far from a Simcha and far from an adequate reference work for those wanting information about Jewish holidays. Max Weinreich, founding figure of modern Yiddish linguistics, and of course, YIVO, wrote an incensed letter to the editors of McGraw-Hill, which had also published his son's dictionary the same year. In it, Weinreich suggests that, quote, there is no doubt of Rosten's love of the language, but his knowledge is very limited, gently put. Writing for the Vorwärts, the New York Yiddish Daily founded in 1896, the Vilna-born Mortkhe Kosover, excuse the typo, offered a similar assessment. A professor of Hebrew literature at Brooklyn College, Kosover was the first director of YIVO, in New York, and in December 1968, he wrote 2 articles in the Sunday supplement of Vorwärts examining books about Yiddish that had recently entered the English book market. According to Kosover, these books were primarily purchased by, quote, Jews born here, Yidden geborene do, that is, in America, who want to, quote, return to the Yiddish of their parents' home, as well as by Jews who had become interested in Yiddish for various reasons, and non-Jews who, quote, want to learn something about their Jewish neighbors or business partners. He added that the Joys of Yiddish was a serious book with faults. Those are his words. Rosten often mixes Ashkenazi with Sephardic pronunciations in his transliterations. Rosten, he noted, also includes words such as Adonai that are not used in Yiddish, and the volume, moreover, contains multiple errors. In one instant, Rosten misassigns the definition for Havdalah, the special ceremony that separates the Holy Sabbath from other days of the week, for the entry of Lahavdil. Remember, I talked about Lahavdil Lashon earlier in the talk. Elsewhere, Kosover dismisses the Eastern European market town of Schnippeschok as, quote, a mythical place, when in fact, notes Kosover, the location with a seemingly funny-sounding name referring to the Vilnius suburb now known as Schnipskis. According to Kosover, Rosten endowed the book with a Sach Liebschaft zu Yiddish, aber nicht kein zu viel Wissen, much love for Yiddish, but not too much knowledge. He added that, quote, American Jews will enjoy Leo Rosten's book and will certainly be delighted by the jokes he tells. The implication is that native speakers of Yiddish, here contrasted to American Jews, will not find it to be all that joyful. So Kosover's words point to the third general formula of praise bestowed on the volume, namely that it's funny. As the novelist Belle Kaufman, the granddaughter of Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, declared, the work demonstrated, quote, the delicious marriage of scholarship and entertainment. While specific entries, such as those related to Jewish ritual practice, were often rather dry, the majority of entries were defined by way of funny anecdotes, jokes, or witticisms. For Rosten, invoking jokes and humorous stories was an efficient technique for communicating meaning when straightforward definitions seem not to capture the full resonance of the term. Humor, Rosten explains, is, quote, the affectionate communication of insight. And readers responded in kind, with laughter. A reader in Texas, for example, reflected, quote, I cannot recall in recent years so many delightful, delicious moments of continuous laughter. By 1968, I would note here, Yiddish was well recognized as a language endowed with uninterrogated, humorous affect, the result of various factors from the prominence of Jewish dialect humor to the lasting legacy of the Borscht Belt to the more frequent inclusions of Yiddish terms in the entertainment industry. Rosten's work continued in this vein, and his readers and his reviewers were quick to note the hilarity of the text. Jim Bishop, in a syndicated review, wrote autobiographically of reading the work at home, quote, this Irish family read it and laughed until we wept. He then added, quote, Yiddish, of course, is not a proper language. It is a semantic emotion. Bishop's words remind contemporary readers of the post-vernacular Yiddish landscape into which Rosten's work entered and helped to create. The humor of the book became a proxy for the presumed humor of the language writ large. And although Rosten maintained in his preface that Yiddish was a language, he did not shy away from stereotyping it as intrinsically humorous. Yiddish, he wrote, is a language that never takes its tongue out of its cheek. So the third version of joy included in this text made this eminently clear, a machaya. A machaya, as Rosten explains, might be defined as pleasure, great enjoyment, a real joy. Deriving from the Hebrew term for one who gives life, Rosten elaborates the machaya is invariably uttered with a smile, a grin, a patting of the stomach, a pleased cluck or shake of the head. The term becomes a byword for Yiddish itself, as the pleased cluck or shake of the head complements the language's perpetual tongue-in-cheek nature. And the image of Yiddish as coterminous with droll humor continues in the anecdote that Rosten includes in the machaya entry. The anecdote, which you have before you, reads in full. I'll tell you. So Finsterval stumbled along the street, limping, moaning, groaning, and having that problem, sorry, where my picture is covering the, one second, I apologize, the slide. So Finsterval stumbled along the street, limping, moaning, groaning, leaving a trail of oives in his way. A stranger stopped him. What's the matter? What's the matter? My shoes are absolutely killing me. So why do you wear them? I'll tell you, my business couldn't be worse. I owe the butcher, the baker, the grocer, the landlord. I have 2 daughters, so ugly, who knows if I'll ever be able to get them married. My son is a zhlub, and my wife nags until I can go crazy. I come home each night from a fruitless day's work, and I look at the bills and at my family, and at that point I could kill myself. So I take off my shoes, and mister, the minute these shoes are off my feet, it's such a machaya. It's the only thing that makes life worth living. So the problem with webinars is you can't hear if anyone is laughing, but usually when I read this, there is laughter. So let's imagine this, the soundscape of laughter. And the punchline is quite clever. A machaya, Rosten explained earlier in his definition, comes from the Hebrew meaning one who gives life. Here, the definitional resonances extend to make it something that makes life worth living. But the humor of the piece may lie elsewhere. After all, the joke appears fixed in an imagined English language context. Present is the ubiquitous landlord, prominent in ethnic American writing, and Finsterwald refers to his interlocutor as Mr., when another term might have suggested an East European context. Yet what elicits the laughter is not a critical engagement with an implied American context, but that this model of comedic deflation is peppered with Yiddish terms, the whiny diphthonged oi, oive, the fricative fronted zhlub, the gutturally anchored machaya. Yiddish, according to the joke, sounds funny, and that in turn is part of the joy. Now, of course, for Rosten's critics, there was nothing celebratory or joyful in a vision of Yiddish as always already funny. Mortimer Cohen, writing for Commentary magazine, agreed. The former president of the Jewish Book Council, Cohen was at the time the rabbi of the Frank Lloyd Wright-designed congregation Beth Shalom in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. Cohen took immediate umbrage at Rosten's choice of words. Did Rosten deliberately seek out the most taste-eroding and grubby idioms in the Yiddish language, he asked. More than individual terms, he resented the jokes themselves. According to Cohen, Rosten butchers his jokes, universalizing Yiddish humor rather than continuing a tradition of Yiddish humor. For example, Cohen claims that, quote, Rosten favors the Hollywood TV punchline method of storytelling, in which a word or phrase ends the narration and provides a laugh. However, this device is precisely the opposite of the narrative method employed by the giants of Yiddish humor of the 19th and 20th century. So to summarize, Rosten has offered 3 terms for joy, for Yiddish joy: Naches, familial joy; Simcha, ritual joy; and Machaya, vivifying joy, humorous. Each of these terms is American, humorous, and derives from the Hebraic component. Taken as a trio, the terms Naches, Simcha, and Machaya also point to an evolving thread in the development of post-vernacular Yiddish-American culture that finds particular meaning in Yiddish words that derive from the language's Hebraic component. Joy, the Joys of Yiddish implies, must be etymologically marked as Jewish for it to resonate. Indeed, while the volume contains terms sourced from all 3 dominant linguistic components of Yiddish, again, the Germanic, the Slavic, and the Hebraic Aramaic, the largest number of words derive from the Hebraic Aramaic stratum. There are over twice as many words identified by Rosten as Hebrew than as German, even though Yiddish is predominantly Germanic in grammar and lexicon. In cases where a term combines both components, for example, Rosten also repeatedly privileges the Hebraic. In the entry for chametz, for example, something that is not eaten during Passover, he notes that the term is, quote, from the Hebrew, chametz, sour, leaven, fermented, but he does not comment on the Germanic suffix. And while Rosten does acknowledge that Yiddish emerged in a Germanic context, he adds the qualification that, quote, the new parlance was a melange of Middle High German, some Old German, remnants of Old French and Italian, Hebrew names and phrases in local dialects. He then indicates that it was only in the Slavic territorial context that Yiddish began to, quote, raise its own young. Repeatedly, one senses a hesitation on the part of Rosten to engage Yiddish as a Germanic language. And the sense was confirmed in a 1969 Yiddish language interview that Rosten participated in for New York's Tog Morgen Journal, conducted by Shimon Baker. There, Rosten expressed both his admiration of and frustration with Uriel Weinreich's dictionary. Although scholarly in breadth, he lamented that Weinreich's work had left out too many of the nicht schöne, the unrefined words, and at the same time, it had, quote, exhibited too prominently words of German origin at a time when, quote, we want to get away from that. 2 decades after the Holocaust, Rosten was eager for Yiddish to assert its distance from German and likely to preclude a connection between Yiddish as a language of humor with German as a language of genocide. Instead, Rosten's work suggests that a Hebraic Yiddish is the dominant site of Jewish and Yiddish joy. This circumscribed vision of Yiddish joy makes it all the more noticeable that when the Yiddish language writers examined Rosten's work, they did not invoke any of the 3 joyful Hebraic terms offered by Rosten. So, for example, writing for the Vorwärts, Kosover identified Rosten's work as die Freuden von Yiddish and putting in parentheses a transliteration, die Joys of Yiddish. Modifying the title and slightly, Rosten's interlocutor in the Tog Morgen Journal called it die Freude von Yiddish, the singular joy. The obvious translation of Rosten's title lay not with Naches, Simcha, or Machaya, but the vernacular term Freude, and Freude itself is a word of Germanic origin, akin to Freude, and it might be considered a basic and unqualified translation of joy. For example, it's the first definition for joy in Weinreich's bilingual dictionary. And similarly, in the recent Comprehensive English-Yiddish Dictionary of 2016, edited by Gittel Schechter-Viswanath and Paul Glaser, die Freude is the first option provided for the English joy. Freude, moreover, was a term that Yiddish readers of the 1960s may have seen displayed on their bookshelves. In 1968, the LA-based writer Yecheskel Bronstein published his Freude von Yetzirah, The Joy of Creation, a collection that included various essays on Yiddish writing, literary criticism, and Yiddish literary profiles. 3 years earlier, in 1965, the Yiddish Kulturverband, the Jewish Culture Association, published lesser-known poet Mortkhe Kosover's collection of poetry for children and adults entitled Freude und Wunder, Joy and Wonder. And 4 years before that, the highly regarded modernist poet Yankov Gladstein published his paean to the Yiddish language entitled Die Freude vom Jiddischen Wort, the joy of the Yiddish word. The collection took its name from Gladstein's penultimate poem, whose speaker demands of his addressee, quote, "Oh, let me through to the joy of the Yiddish word. Oh, los mich zu der Freude vom Jiddischen Wort." It is there, in the whole full days of Yiddish joy, that the speaker imagines he will be able to express himself most fully. Rosten himself name-checked Gladstein to indicate his Yiddish bona fides in a Yiddish interview. But this volume goes unnamed, and I'd be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. The prominence of Yiddish Freude only serves to highlight its absence from the joys of Yiddish. I want to suggest that the vernacularity of Freude, its use by contemporary Yiddish speakers, its Germanic root, its ostensible ordinariness, brings into relief the post-vernacular affective goals and strategies of Rosten's book. For Rosten's work did not set itself up as a textbook for the Yiddish language, as a guide to the extant Yiddish culture of the 1960s, or as a phrasebook for daily Yiddish interactions. Rather, it tasked itself with orienting a reading community around an emotional reception of Yiddish. And most remarkably, it succeeded in doing so. Rosten's work generated joy by sourcing familial pride in language recognition, Naches, by providing a general Jewish education alongside its linguistic work, Simcha, and by giving readers a chance to laugh, smirk, and nod in recognition, Mechaya. As such, the plural joy of Rosten's work resonated widely and clearly. But the invocation of Freude by Rosten's Yiddish readers reminds us there remains an urgent question, and it is one his English critics cannot answer by virtue of their language. The question is not what are the affective joys of Yiddish in English, but what are the emotional investments of joy in Yiddish? What, in other words, are the Freuden of Yiddish? And my insistence on turning to Freude in Yiddish renders me something of a killjoy. But I embrace that position. In her exploration of happiness and affect, cultural critic Sarah Ahmed has pointed out the power of the killjoy. Happiness, Ahmed explains, functions as a promise that directs us towards certain objects. In other words, the judgment that some things are good not only precedes our encounter with things, but directs us towards those things. Okay? It's the task of the killjoy, in Ahmed's case, the feminist killjoy, to interrupt the system, to expose normative cultural values that diminish minoritized voices, and to reveal the socialized assumptions that allow only certain objects to be perceived as bearing positive affect. The feminist killjoy thereby reacts when faced with stereotype and received valuations of joy. She does not kill joy per se, but instead she questions the conditions that have facilitated the joy in the first place. So following Ahmed, I argue for the Yiddish killjoy and what I have named the Yiddish kvetch. So why kvetch? Because it's a word that Rosten translates and knows better. In English and Yiddish, kvetch means to complain. Here, you see a painting by Mel Bachner, who was inspired by Rosten's work. But kvetchen in Yiddish does not mean to complain. The noun in Yiddish actually means stress or accent. The verbal form kvetchen means to squeeze or to pinch. The reflexion kvetchen sich means to force oneself, to speak reluctantly, to equivocate. It's only in American English of the 20th century that the polysemous kvetch would become the kvetch of complaint. And regarding the term itself, Rosten was in communication with Rachel Shoshke Ehrlich, the long-standing research associate at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, concerning this term. In 1964, Ehrlich worked with Rosten on various translations. As she explained in a letter to Rosten, quote, "Although of Yiddish origin, this word was created by English-speaking boys whose knowledge of Yiddish words were related to mother and toilet training." And in his archive, I found a draft where Rosten notes this in an earlier manuscript version of the Joys of Yiddish before choosing to delete that recognition in the final publication. So my project asks us to kvetch, not to complain, but to examine the multiple stresses imposed on and by Yiddish, to squeeze the Yiddish terms in order to find connotative nuance or denotative complexity, to force oneself to question one's assumptions about Yiddish, and to equivocate about the potential for Yiddish to make meaning in a manner that sidesteps the stereotypical affect ascribed to it in a Jewish American discourse. My project examines Yiddish joy in the work of Yankov Glatstein, the prose of Frater Stock, the humor of Shlomo Aleichem, and the contemporary visual art of artists such as Yevgeny Fix and Mel Bachner. My goal, again, is to map the genealogy of Yiddish Frade, distinct from its monopolization in post-vernacular American Yiddish culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny. This was a wonderful talk. And we've got some great questions in the Q&A, and I have some questions as well. But first, I thought we could just start off with a simple question. What brought you to this topic? Why did you choose to do this research?
So I am also guilty, thanks for that question, of the seriousness of the Yiddish scholar. And one of the challenges of engaging with Yiddish is trying to disarticulate Yiddish from its monopolization as always already funny. And I was thinking to myself, well, why not look towards this iconic book, The Joys of Yiddish, which is a book that so many people know and so many people ask about, and it's a remarkable cultural object. I'd like to learn about its impact, and I assumed that there would be a reception history of it, and there wasn't. So the first step was trying to create this reception history. And at the same time, I was very interested in the poetry of Yankov Glatstein, who I mentioned at the end. And for Yankov Glatstein, the idea of joy is very complex. It's not like I'm saying in English Yiddish joy is bad and Yiddish joy is good. For Glatstein, he's very concerned that ideas of joy universalizes. Ideas of joy can conscript people into movements of mass politics. And so joy actually opens up into larger questions of how various Yiddish cultural figures understood the emotional communities that they were embedded in. And so it's allowed me to research both Yiddish in an English language context and in a Yiddish language context.
You mentioned that you used Leo Rosten's archive. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? Where is this material and what's the scope of it?
So the Rosten archive is housed at Brandeis, though I used also materials, as I mentioned in the talk, at YIVO. But the majority of Leo Rosten's archive is at Brandeis, and working with the archive is a bit treacherous in the sense that clearly Rosten received thousands of, I'm saying thousands, I should say hundreds and nigh on thousands of fan mail. But what's not included in the archive are any letters that are disparaging. And so one can only assume that these were thrown away. And part of Rosten's work is cultivating a certain image, right? And he's an incredible self-promoter. It's not surprising that he was able to get so many people to write him. He sent books to everybody. So he's a very efficient self-promoter, and he kind of became, with the success of the Joys of Yiddish, a one-man industry. There's the new Joys of Yiddish, there's books of quotations, there's all sorts of Yiddish afterlives. The book is translated, it's been translated into German multiple times, into Czech, into French. There's an entire industry, but the archive itself, which is quite large and well curated and self curated, I would posit, is primarily at Brandeis.
You mentioned the revised new edition. We did have someone ask about that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, Alex?
The new revised edition.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the changes that happens in subsequent editions is there are multiple transliterations used, sometimes that are more Yiddish sounding, sometimes that accord more to Israeli pronunciation. You heard it when I said Simchat Torah, right? It doesn't just say Simchas Torah. So the most recent editions include YIVO transliterations of the terms, again, making an imprimatur of scholarly rigor. But they also include small illustrations and daubing that look like Marc Chagall images of fiddlers and floating individuals. So the book itself takes on, the book itself continues to perform an image of what is Jewish culture, and it affirms an image, right? It's confirming, it's creating and affirming an image, and that image is broadly one that imagines Fiddler on the Roof through the lens of Chagall, not through Shalom Aleichem, who had no fiddler on a roof, right? Becomes part and parcel of the Joys of Yiddish. And in different languages, it's in German, it becomes known as an encyclopedia. So there are different paratextual changes that happen in subsequent editions, but it remains in print.
Fascinating. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the publisher, McGraw-Hill. I mean, it's amazing that this was published by the same publisher that published Earl Weinreich's dictionary, which of course comes out the same year. So one viewer asked about whether or not this was kind of accepted as a book immediately, or if Rosten had to kind of argue for it. It's really interesting to think that they picked both of these books. I mean, I don't know if it was different departments, how that works, but yeah, is there anything else you can tell us about the publisher?
I don't know the answer to that. I can only I'll answer with the non-answer, which is 1968. One reviewer wrote was the year of Yiddish. So Yiddish for Yankees, it was an image I showed. Yiddish for Yankees was another book that was published, a joke book. So there's an obvious market for this, but I'd have to look at the archive of the Weinreich dictionary to find out what the process of creating that dictionary was.
I was going to say, when you said that Rosten has removed all of the negative letters,
I surmise.
Yeah, right. Well, presumably, I mean, as you pointed out, various YIVO people were extremely critical of this when it came out, and I would bet that you could find lots of angry letters, from the YIVO people that you mentioned and others in our archives about this project.
Yeah, certainly.
One topic that it's coming up in the questions, and I was curious about it also, this topic of Deutschmerism, of German, but actually, yeah, I mean, maybe Leo Rosten's thinking about German words in Yiddish a little bit differently than, say, like Max Weinreich or Earl Weinreich thought about German words in Yiddish. But it's just an interesting point that this, on both sides of this divide, they were actually concerned about being too Germanic, because, the Weinreichs could have famously flagged words that were too German in their dictionary, and yet Leo Rosten is saying that they actually are being too German, and he's, going further or looking at it a little bit differently. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about, what was driving his aversion to German, how he understood that, and the relationship between the kind of YIVO Deutschmerist problem.
So it sounds like maybe one way to address the question is to think about what German does in Yiddish, very, very broadly conceived. And one thing it does, I think, in the Weinreich dictionary is it gives you many technical terms in the words of Germanic origin, not just basic terms, right? Because in Yiddish, words of German and Hebrew and Slavic origin can be all sorts of registers, from the mundane to the most sophisticated. And you can see there's a concern in Weinreich that you don't want to have a Deutschmerism, but you do have lots of words of German origin because you need to have the scale. You need to have a broad range of Yiddish terms to confront the everyday life of 1968. For Rosten, and there are words of Germanic origin. I don't want to undersell that. What's most important is this flavor of Jewishness that he wants to communicate. And so if something, I would posit that if something feels too German, it doesn't have the Hebraic Aramaic flair. And more than that, when he says he wants to get away from all that, he's part of a larger discussion, very active among Yiddishists, including Gladstein, about what to do with the German language. And here we're entering into a much broader discussion and a transnational discussion of the resonances of German after the war. And, when I often talk about Yiddish and post-vernacular culture, you can talk about, when people talk about the German language, people often say, and I'm in the German unit in the German Nordic Slavic, well, German sounds harsh. But that's where we've been culturally conditioned to imagine that German sounds harsh through various cultural objects, right? Through war movies, etc. And so it's not that it's unique that the post-vernacular Yiddish elicits a response. But the question is, why does it elicit the response that it does? And I think you see in Rosten that the German doesn't sound like what he wants Yiddish to sound like. It doesn't sound sarcastic. It doesn't sound sentimental, and it doesn't sound familial. And so the words that he chooses, with joy in particular, are words that he thinks can tap into those qualities, those characteristics.
That's fascinating. And I love the Glotstein that you brought in. You said you had some other, if you want to finish with some other thoughts about Glotstein and his view of joy. And I just want to say that we actually use that quote, O los mich zu die Freude für die Jiddischen Wort. We use that as the quote on the back of one of our Yiddish summer program t-shirts. I forget, it was in recent years, but it's a wonderful quote. Yeah, so Glotstein and joy.
So I recently, I published an article recently about joy across Glotstein's oeuvre, because he's mostly a poet primarily known as either mourning Eastern Europe in his post-war poetry, or for neologistic flair in his pre-war and post-war poetry as well. But he's primarily known as a poet of rage. And what I try to show is that rage is also a source of joy. And he's concerned that when one feels joy, it's often in moments of a lack of control, of rage, of mass politicking, of losing oneself in a poetic tradition. And for him, joy is a threat. And it works very differently than in Rosten. It's if Rosten is this popular mode, Glotstein is insistently serious, and writing in modernist poetry, which is, by definition will have a much smaller audience. But I would encourage those who are interested in even that poetic line, that's so powerful, especially when it's abstracted from its context. Think, what do it mean to enter the Yiddish joy? What would it mean to enter this world of Yiddish and to joy? And for Glotstein, that isn't necessarily an automatic good. And so if you're interested, I would encourage everyone to read lots of Glotstein. He is a very, very different writer than Leo Rosten.
That's to say the least.
Yeah.
Well, Sunny, thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We have some other good questions here. Sorry that we didn't get a chance to get to everything. But in particular, for maybe in one moment of overtime here, Miriam Borden, I'm just going to read her question. She says, "Love this whole project. Thanks for a really fun talk, Sunny. I wonder about orality, not as in Yiddish sounds funny, but in the deep orality of Yiddish as it comes across in Rosten's book. So many of the definitions/examples he offers are dialogues. To what extent can we read joys as some kind of extension, perhaps a condensed homage of the orality of Yiddish literature, Mendele, Shalom Aleichem in particular, for a post-war American audience?"
That's a fascinating and generous read, and I'll look forward to keep talking about it with you, Miriam. I think there's certainly something. There's no way to read Rosten's book without imagining that it's being read out loud. Right? This is it's a communal practice of reading. Even if you take it off the shelf and you read one, you can imagine saying, "Oh, let me read you what I just read," to whoever walks into the room, because it's genuinely funny. So I take that and I appreciate that, and I'll continue to think with it. Thanks, Miriam.
Excellent. Thank you again, Sunny, and thanks everyone for joining us. We've got lots more lectures coming up. Tomorrow we are on a break from Yiddish civilization. We've got a talk, a share your own story event about Morris cats. We have a wonderful exhibit up right now. So if you have a Morris cats story, come tomorrow at 1 o'clock and share it. And then Thursday we'll be back for a Yiddish language lecture with Lisa Bemperad on pogroms in Ukraine. And check out our website for more events that are coming up. And thank you again.